Today, I'd like to lay my discussion down in terms of, first of all, defining what I think is the traditional ideas or understandings of middle powers. And then I'd like to shift to what I think is happening in terms of what I call neo-middle power diplomacy. And I'd like to couch this in the context of what's happening within the Indo-Pacific. And how I'm going to do that, I'm going to talk about converging and diverging interests of middle powers within the region, and then formulate or at least provide what I think are some areas of potential cooperation where middle powers can exert their agency. And I think that's really important as the US-China bilateral relationship spirals in a direction that is perhaps dangerous. Middle powers need to find agency within this process so that it's not the strategic competition between the United States and China that's shaping the region, but rather middle powers contributing to how that region is being shaped, inculcating their interests. And I think the interests should revolve around rules-based behavior within the region, but also shaping the region in a way that is not strictly about power. So I think when we're looking at and thinking about the concept of middle powers, the traditional understandings of middle powers, I think, kind of trifurcate into three particular areas. One is a very functional view. The second is a hierarchical view. And the third is a normative view. So when we're thinking about middle powers from the viewpoint of a functional viewpoint, many scholars think about it in terms of which particular areas of cooperation that they can do they have synergy? So, for example, Canada and the Scandinavian countries cooperated a lot on human security. So that was a functional area of cooperation or peacekeeping. And I think that this was an area that they limited their cooperation to as middle powers. And I'll come back to that. A hierarchical understanding of middle powers is thinking about how middle powers compare to other powers. And a very good barometer, I think, of middle powers in terms of hierarchy comes out of the Lowy Institute in Sydney. It's called the Asian Power Index. And in this index, it puts together a really, really excellent comprehensive profile of the various powers, the power ranking within the region. And of course, at the top, we have the United States and China. And well below that, about 20 points on the scale, we have Japan and Australia, interesting enough, hitting much above their belt. And then we have India, and then the powers descend in order. But I think the Lowy Institute's Asian Power Index is really useful for helping us to visualize what exactly is power, and how power can be exerted, both in the forms of economy, trade, diplomacy, of course, security, and soft power. And again, this is where we find Japan and Australia actually performing really high above their military or economic power. So this hierarchical understanding of middle powers is another way to understand what middle powers are. The third understanding of middle powers, I think, that was developed in the 1980s and 2000s, really was this normative understanding of what middle powers was. So normative in the sense that middle powers were advocating for specific values and specific norms, and to buttress international institutions. So they were interested in international law. And much of their advocacy resulted in things like banning landmines, or focusing on human security, or the human security from the standpoint of freedom from fear. So many countries like Canada in the 1990s formulated their middle power diplomacy focusing on these kinds of normative-based ideas. The challenges for countries today is that the international environment has transformed so significantly compared to the 1980s and 1990s, when these traditional forms of middle power diplomacy were being conducted. In the 1990s, of course, the United States was at the peak of its power. Some French scholars call it the hyperpower. But whether we call it a hyperpower or the superpower or a unipolar moment, what we could see is that those traditional middle powers, such as the Scandinavian countries or Canada, the UK, and France, they could conduct their normative or hierarchical middle power with the understanding that the United States could provide a stable background and a stable organization and a stable international order for middle powers to conduct their diplomacy in areas that they could translate their capacities and capabilities into really some form of diplomacy. And as I mentioned, I think the banning of landmines is a very good example of middle power diplomacy. Strengthening and trying to buttress the international system and focusing on human rights or human security or other, I think, solid forms of, of middle power diplomacy. But fast forward to today, the international setting has transformed dramatically. Of course, in the 1990s, China was a very, very small economy, but today it is number 2. And if we look at purchasing power index, China is actually the biggest economy globally. Today, what we see under President Trump is an American first, the United States, a United States that is not focusing and buttressing the international system, not prioritizing multilateralism, and actually taking a preference for unilateral behavior. And what we see is that it's stressing its bilateral relationships across the board, whether it's the Korea American relationship, Japan American relationship, even the Australian American relationship. Now, the traditional partners of the United States are wondering what is the direction of the United States under this president. And of course, the big question for many of us in this setting is what's going to happen in November? Will President Trump be reelected, and how will this impact the international order and the United States' willingness to engage in multilateral cooperation with its traditional partners and allies, but also, I think, important, growing and deepening partners like India or Southeast Asian countries. And that's a really interesting question for us to think about. What is the direction of these countries? So with that, I think what we've seen is those traditional middle powers, such as Australia, Canada, South Korea, Japan is arguably a middle power, are starting to reconceptualize what middle power diplomacy is. And this is where I use the term neo-middle power diplomacy. And, Hunter Martinson's on the call today. And, he and Ali Wynn wrote a really interesting middle powers essay in Foreign Policy just this week. So I encourage everybody to take a read of that. It's a very interesting essay talking about the need for middle powers to strengthen the international system. But I think what we're seeing today is middle powers engaging in what I call neo-middle power diplomacy. And I think the primary features of that diplomacy really focus in a movement away from a purely functional form of cooperation and relationship in the international system. It's moving away from hierarchical understandings of middle power diplomacy. And I think its normative aspect of its middle power diplomacy has transformed. And it's transformed to a point of trying to find agency. And what I mean by agency is to ensure that the strategic competition between the United States and China is not the determining factor in how a new international order emerges or evolves in the Indo-Pacific. And this is really, really critical for, I think, countries like India or Japan or South Korea. They don't want to have the rules written for them. They want to be part of that rules-making process. So they're in many ways trying to exert agency in this process. And that agency is revolving around multilateralism and buttressing and committing themselves to multilateralism. It's also about focusing on preserving a rules-based order, and that's a really different articulation than a liberal international order. And we've seen many countries migrate away from that concept of a liberal international order to focus on a rules-based order, a rules-based understanding of the region. And I think that, depends on which authors you're interested in. John Mishemer in his Great Delusion book, or Stephen Walt's new book, really are stressing that the liberal international order was somewhat of an exception if we look at international relations over history. And in their understandings, they see a rules-based order as being something that countries are striving for. So when we take a look at this understanding of middle power diplomacy and this idea of exerting agency and trying to buttress the international system and forge a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific, I think there's some really important converging themes or converging areas of interest that many countries within the region are looking at. And when I'm thinking of middle powers in terms of their converging interests, I'm going to focus on first India, Japan, Australia, South Korea, um, as the middle powers in this Pacific region for this particular dialogue. So when we look at some of the important areas of convergence for middle powers, I think one of the important ones, of course, is denuclearization. For India, they're concerned about their neighbor Pakistan and its burgeoning or nuclear capabilities. For Northeast Asian countries, they're worried about the nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and what does it mean for North Korea to continue to not only retain nuclear weapons, but for those nuclear weapons to be potentially part of a proliferation program um, within the region. So I think that this is a particular area of convergence for middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, is thinking about denuclearization, thinking about how they can apply their collective capabilities, capacities to deal with denuclearization. Of course, there's divergences here as well. When Japan looks at the denuclearization of the peninsula, the challenge for Japan's not really thinking so much about denuclearization of Pakistan. So when we, although there's convergence in and interest in denuclearization, what we see is some of the key middle powers within the region not feeling comfortable about supporting each other's denuclearization efforts. So I was going back to the idea of convergence of interests of middle powers within the region. And I think one of the key areas of potential cooperation, of course, is talking about denuclearization of both the Northeast Asia with North Korea, but also thinking about South Asia with the nuclear proliferation in Pakistan and how that does threaten, I think, India's security. There is convergences here, but what we're seeing is also divergences. Japan is reticent to support, I think, India's position in Pakistan, and India as well is reticent to extend its diplomacy and thinking about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. So these are areas of convergence and divergence. Other, I think, important areas of convergence and divergence are an interest in an infrastructure building within the region and more connectivity. And these are important for development, for integration, but also for countering, I think, the Belt Road Initiative and how the Belt Road Initiative is really shifting regional integration away from a traditional north to south integration, so Northeast Asia to Southeast Asia, to one that's centered from that moves westward along Eurasia from Beijing. I think that infrastructure and connectivity through initiatives such as the Free and Open Indo-Pacific is another important area of convergence in terms of middle power diplomacy, is ensuring that the integration process of economies throughout the Indo-Pacific remains open, remains transparent, remains rules-based. And I think that's something that middle powers are going to continue to focus on and advocate for as they press for more agency in how this region develops. Another important area, of course, is maritime security. And here we have increased challenges in how we think about maritime security in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, and of course in the Indian Ocean. And all these particular areas have different challenges. Of course, India views the Indian Ocean as their backyard, but it's seeing a growing Chinese presence within the region, whether it's ports in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, or Pakistan. As many of my Indian friends say, they feel that there's a pearl necklace being positioned around the subcontinent. For Southeast Asian countries, the equation or the maritime security issue is a little bit different. Um, uh, they're worried about China creating, of course, and dominating the South China Sea, both in terms of sea lanes of communication, but also dominating and controlling the resources within that region. Um, of course, there's the East China Sea with the territorial disputes between Japan and China. And this has both resource-based implications, but also security-based or maritime-based implications as China tries to expand its blue water capabilities so that it can freely move into the Pacific and extend its power throughout the region. So these are all areas of convergence in terms of interest of middle powers within the within the Indo-Pacific, because they all have interest in open sea lanes of communication. They all have interest in a rules-based behavior within these regions, but at the same time, there's an area of divergence in that there's a different focus for different middle powers within this region. So we need to build some crosswalks between these different interests so that there can be more cooperation within the maritime domain. And focusing on traditional security in this particular context. Where there's more opportunity for cooperation, I think, amongst middle powers is in the areas of non-traditional security. And this, again, is in the maritime domain. And when I'm thinking about non-traditional security in the maritime domain within the Indo-Pacific, I'm thinking about piracy, I'm thinking about illegal fishing. I'm thinking about climate change and how it's going to severely impact the entire region, and how all of these are going to reshape how economies work, the stability of the societies within the Indo-Pacific, and how there is a collective need to cooperate on these particular areas. Now, let me just give you a very good example: the Mekong Delta. The Mekong Delta feeds approximately 500 million Southeast Asians, and it's being inundated by climate change. It's being challenged by climate change. And the question is about the future stability of ASEAN and the future stability of the region is what happens when climate change causes the Mekong Delta to become more salinated. How do they continue to feed their people? Now, this particular example is the same for much of South Asia. Because there's many low-lying areas in South Asia that could be affected by climate change, and they already are. So these are really important areas where I think middle powers can exert some agency and engage in more cooperation to ensure that and, that the Indo-Pacific continues to evolve in a stable manner. And I think cooperating in the maritime domain and the non-traditional security issues is going to be increasingly an area of convergence between middle powers within this region. And I think that they're going to need to prioritize this region and form some kind of collective institution to manage these particular areas, because so many countries and so many people and so many economies are going to be negatively impacted by these areas. So just going back to those areas of convergences and divergences in terms of middle power interests within the Indo-Pacific, of course, we have nuclearization or denuclearization, which is a particular interest, the interest in spreading connectivity and infrastructure to ensure that integration remains open, it remains transparent, it remains rules-based. We have hard security issues in the maritime domains that need to focus on cooperation. And then, of course, we have non-traditional security issues, which are going to become increasingly important as climate change does wreak havoc within the region, but also as that havoc has those side effects, those ricochet effects on other aspects of security within the region. If we have more instability along with climate change, this is going to increase illegal fishing, it's going to increase piracy, and this is going to have important negative effects, destabilizing effects within the region. So these are all important areas, I think, of convergence for middle powers. The question is, how do they form and how do they form an institution, or how do they cooperate in these areas to ensure that they can keep the region stable. Now, going back to the U.S.-China competition, this will complicate how middle powers are going to find opportunities to cooperate within the region. And what we already see is that intensification of U.S.-China relations is securitizing the development of the Indo-Pacific. And a securitization of the Indo-Pacific is not what most littoral states prioritize or want within the region. And if you look at the most recent Southeast Asian survey that came out of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, for the past 3 years, Southeast Asian states continue to prioritize economic integration. They continue to prioritize infrastructure connectivity. They continue to prioritize not securitizing the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and we see things like the Indo-Pacific Outlook really representative of that. But we also see the Southeast Asian states wanting to put Southeast Asia, ASEAN, back into the driver's seat of regional integration through this process of the Asian way. So the countries move forward on how integration works through the idea of consensus-based decision making. Now, as we move forward in thinking about how many countries in Indo-Pacific prioritize issues within the region, I would probably argue, and I'd be very interested in hearing from our participants on the line. I'm sure that you prioritize dealing with the non-security issues within the region because they are the most important for maintaining stable economies. The COVID-19 is a very good example of this, of how our economies have been shut down or been scaled back, and it's creating huge challenges for our informal economies. So here, middle powers need to be thinking about what are the needs of Indo-Pacific states within the region. Of course, some provision of security is important, but it's economic integration, it's connectivity, it's dealing with the non-traditional security issues that are the priority for most Indo-Pacific states. And this is the area that I think middle powers need to really focus on, find ways to cooperate. And importantly, those middle powers need to articulate very clearly to the United States that the best way to deal with security issues and non-security issues within the Indo-Pacific is through multilateral cooperation. And here I see neo-middle power diplomacy is going to be about advocacy. It's going to be about using its collective relationships with the United States to shape the United States behavior and pull it back away from unilateralism. And some of you might be saying, well, Mr. Biden, if he's elected, will probably turn back to to unilateralism. We don't know, and the structural forces that are pushing the U.S.-China relationship in a negative direction may suggest that the United States may not turn back to a multilateralist state. Rather, it may be less unilateral. But I think that the structural pressures on the United States suggest that it's going to be needed. Middle powers are going to have to strongly encourage a potential Biden administration to come back to the multilateralism table, at least at a functional level, issue by issue level. In terms of how middle powers need to function and need to cooperate with China, here I think there's a little bit different formula. And what we've seen is many middle powers have had their relationships exploited with China, and that relationship with China has been used as leverage to shape their policies. So back in April, Australia called for an international investigation against China for the origins of the COVID-19 virus. And what we saw is the Chinese were venomous in their criticism of Australia. They put a series of tariffs on the Australian economy, and they threatened to stop tourists and students coming to the Australia to study or for tourism. This kind of economic coercion can't be dealt with unilaterally by Australia. It's too small. The asymmetric relationships just don't work. Canada as well, with the arrest of the Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou back in December 2018, we saw China, arrest Canadians and then put economic sanctions on Canada as well. And in the wake of the installment of THAAD missiles in South Korea, we also saw the Chinese put pressure on the South Koreans through various kinds of economic coercive policies. So when we're looking at middle power diplomacy, we have to think about how middle powers can cooperate and work collectively to put pressure on China, but also the United States. Remember, the United States slapped steel tariffs on many countries when President Trump came into power. So middle powers need to work collectively to pressure the United States and bring it back to multilateralism, but I think they're going to need to work collectively to put pressure and to withstand pressure from China. So this leads me to, I think, three areas or four areas that I think neo-middle power diplomacy is going to continue to move forward and continue to find areas of cooperation. And then I'll stop there and open up the floor to questions. But I think that as we move forward in the Indo-Pacific, neo-middle power diplomacy is going to really focus on probably four particular areas. The first area is going to be on traditional security, finding ways to expand traditional security cooperation. Now, this is not necessarily, for example, cooperation that's aimed directly at China. Traditional security cooperation could be enhancing each other's maritime awareness capabilities in the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean or the East China Sea. So using their collective capabilities to get a better sense of what's happening on the seas and below the seas. And that's really critical to be able to push back against assertive countries within the region. Traditional security issues could also be enforcing sanctions on countries that are proliferating or developing nuclear technology or other weapons of mass destruction. And we've already seen some examples of this with Canada, France, the UK, and other countries using surveillance activities to enforce sanctions on South Korea or North Korea. There perhaps is an argument for doing the same in other parts of the Indo-Pacific to countries that are proliferating weapons of mass destruction or developing weapons of mass destruction. In the areas of non-traditional security, here I think that middle powers can have a very active role in HDR, or HADR, so humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This is an important area of cooperation where they can develop interoperability skills. They can provide a good public good to the region. And they can develop better communication and shared norms of how to deal with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. I think search and rescue is another area that many countries could be cooperating with, those middle powers. And why I say they can cooperate, because I think individually they don't have the capabilities to do as a good job as moving collectively. So it's pooling their capabilities and pooling their capacities to have more effective search and rescue and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And we've had many examples of a need for this, whether it's Aceh, whether it's typhoons and cyclones and hurricanes within the region. There's a real need for dealing with non-traditional security issues. And here I think a really important and the most contemporary example of this is really dealing with pandemic diseases. Here, I think that middle powers have a huge role in using their collective capabilities and capacities to help deal with pandemic diseases. And COVID-19 is a really, really good example of this. I think wise policy following SARS or MERS would have been middle powers finding and developing an international institution that focuses on pandemics within the region. And that means collective research. It means pooling of resources. It means keeping supply chains open for personal protective equipment. Here, middle powers have a huge role in dealing with non-traditional security issues and the example of transnational diseases. In terms of trade, I think that it's important that middle powers continue to advocate for multilateralism. Here, Japan has been a leader. After the United States withdrew from the TPP, Japan took up the torch. It signed and delivered the CPTPP, and it's actively advocating for new members, such as the UK, such as the Philippines, such as Thailand. And I think this is really an important way to continue to move forward. Japan has also signed the Japan EU EPA, which is, again, putting Japan in another huge economic agreement. And this multilateralism is really important to build shared standards and shared norms. And it shows Japan is finding agency in this process. Another good example is the Japan EU Asia Connectivity Project. Here again, Japan is showing leadership in terms of an agency in terms of trying to shape the region and shape how infrastructure and connectivity is deployed within the region. And I shouldn't forget the Asian Africa Growth Corridor with Japan and India cooperating. Lots of examples of how we can work on trade and infrastructure and where middle powers can show leadership and agency to shape the region. And that's really, really critical, because I think if we let Beijing shape the region through the BRI, what we're going to see is a China-centered regionalism. If we let the United States continue to its current track, we're going to have a securitarized Indo-Pacific, which is not in the interests of any of the middle powers or other stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific. Lastly, I'd like to just touch upon, I think what's really important is collective diplomacy. And I want to go back to those examples of hostage diplomacy, of economic coercion, and of course, even border disputes that we've seen with India and China over the past few months. China has a strong practice of, and the saying is, you kill the monkey, or you kill the chicken to scare the monkey. I hope everyone understands that expression. And what we've seen is China effectively deploy punitive economic measures on countries, or engage in hostage diplomacy to shape the behavior of different countries when it disagrees with their policies. Here, the only way to effectively secure your interests is collective diplomacy. So when South Korea was when South Korea was really a victim of China's economic coercion following the deployment of THAAD missiles, South Korea took the brunt of on its economy. Here, countries should have stepped in and said, "Hey, you're not going to allow China to do this to South Korea." The same when Canadians were arrested following the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. This hostage diplomacy shouldn't be appropriate, and middle powers need to collectively apply pressure to countries that are engaged in this kind of behavior. And the same with economic sanctions. I advocate this idea of a three musketeers clause, where one for all and all for one. So just to go back to this idea, as we're thinking about middle power diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific, I think that we're really going to see a step up of this more proactive middle power diplomacy in the areas of traditional security, non-traditional security, trade, infrastructure, connectivity, and collective diplomacy to try and ensure that the region is not shaped by this strategic competition between the United States and China. And I think that the urgency of this is going to continue because middle powers and other powers are going to be squeezed further and further and further. And I'd just like to end with one final example because it's really interesting. Huawei and Huawei's technology and 5G. So the UK has just announced that it's going to get Huawei out of their systems by 2027. Now, this is likely because of US pressure on the UK, and we're going to see other countries being pressured by the United States to get the Huawei network out of their countries. The question is how do countries like India or Southeast Asian countries manage this pressure? To buy a Huawei phone in your countries, it's much cheaper than an iPhone. So for you, it's an economic question. And if the United States is going to pressure developing countries or emerging countries to push their security agenda, which includes a technological side, this is going to have severe consequences for how emerging countries are going to deal with and secure technologies and continue their development that's going to be based on technologies of the future. And I think that this is the crux of the problem with the region being shaped by US-China strategic competition, is that it puts middle powers in a very difficult position. It puts emerging countries in a position where they have to choose between development and security. And these are not questions that there's no easy answer to these questions. It's not. It's actually not a choice, right? Development and security should come hand in hand. And here I think that middle powers, and I'm going to include India in this discussion because today India is a middle power, both in terms of its capacities, but most importantly in terms of its norms, what it believes in terms of how to manage problems. It's not a sticks first process, it's carrots and cooperation dialogue. So I'll stop there and I'll open up the floor for communications. And again, thank you very much for listening to me